So, Nova Kakhovka, I think that's how you say it. It is the name of this town and for which a dam is named, or was named, back in the 1950s when it was built by the authorities of the Soviet Union. But as of today, it is no longer. It has been blown away. It was compromised by what appeared to be some shelling, and it has given way, and water is flowing downstream. The banks of the river have widened. I think they said some 80 villages, towns, and even a major city are being flooded as we speak. There are images that look reminiscent of New Orleans in the aftermath of Hurricane Katrina. And by all accounts, it's a very bad situation. Obviously, if you live anywhere in the path of the flooding, you're having a bad day. In fact, everything you own could have been destroyed. Who knows if there were people who were, if the water came in so fast that there were people actually who were caught and, may have drowned. I'm sure that we'll hear about that in the coming days if that's the case. But apparently, within the next week, less than a week, the waters should recede somewhat, and most of the flooding should go down, though the river will continue to flow quite heavily, and the banks will be much wider than they have been when the dam was around. But this aspect of the disaster, it can be dealt with, it can heal, and within a couple months, people can probably get back to living normal lives if it were just the flooding that they had to contend with. After all, floods happen all around the world all the time. Floods are not a uniquely terrible thing. People survive floods, even great floods worse than this. And so these communities likely will survive, they will go on. But the flood waters are not the biggest issue here. Dams are built for a reason. This dam was not built just to create more land, just to narrow the river, just to lessen the flow so that people could build more houses and more businesses in what is now underwater. Dams are built for two reasons. One, to generate electricity, which this dam did, and two, to try and store water, to try and slow the flow of fresh water dumping out into a saltwater body such as the Black Sea. And so this dam was built by the Soviets in the 50s. They dammed up the Dnieper and they created a massive water reservoir off of which they dug canals, which contributed water to irrigate crops across this this entire region of southern Ukraine. This dam was integral to the water supply of those areas, and without it, they're not going to be able to produce the amount of crops that they're used to. Farmers who have been there for generations likely will be ruined, and in the future, I'm sure their land could probably be bought up fairly cheaply by international interests who can afford to wait out the rebuilding of the dam, which the dam likely, I would imagine, will be rebuilt by somebody at some point. But until then, all of this farmland is going to be worth a lot less. It will be much less productive necessarily because they're not going to have the water that they have had for the past 70 years. Furthermore, one of these canals apparently feeds water to Crimea. Remember that for later. So we've seen the videos of the shells hitting the dam. We know that this was man-made. This was not just a bad timing. This is not just a coincidence that this dam happened to give way while the war is going on. We know that it is a direct result of combat, of the war. And so there are two questions to be asked. The first question is, which side did it? Was it Ukraine or was it Russia? The second question, was it intentional or was it an accident? Was it just that this dam happened to be caught in the crossfire between Russia and Ukraine? Or was this dam specifically targeted by one of the two sides in order to cause this disaster and foment all of this chaos and discord? When you blow up a dam, it causes, you have two main things that happen. You have one area that loses a bunch of water, that has too little water, and then you have another area that gets flooded, that has way too much water. And it's not productive for anyone, because when it comes to this part of the Dnieper River, Ukraine controls one side of the river, and Russia controls the other. The Dnieper River, through this area, is the line of control. And so they are flooding villages and cities that are controlled by both Russia and Ukraine. And so I would say that it's a mystery, and that they both seem to suffer. But unfortunately for Ukraine, they just can't keep their big mouths shut. And we have a news story from back in December of 2022, in which the Washington Post details how Ukraine has wargamed out and practiced an assault on this very dam, in which they blow up the dam. And the Washington Post article goes into pretty excruciating detail to explain, yeah, on the surface, this would seem not to benefit Ukraine or Russia to blow this up. It would seem like it would just hurt everybody. But the Ukrainians make the calculus that the flooding would more negatively impact the Russian-held area, and therefore, on net balance, it makes sense to blow up the dam, particularly as a last-ditch effort, because if the Ruskies are going to advance and cross the river, it's much harder for them to do that if the riverbanks are wider, because there's a higher flow. If the river's dammed up, obviously the river at this point is going to be much thinner, and it's going to be much easier for the Ruskies to cross with all of their heavy military equipment into Kherson and and beyond. By widening the river here, it essentially makes it so the Ruskies have to either take boats or something, which would not be very economical or safe, or they just have to find another way across the river somewhere else. So, according to the Washington Post, it would seem to be the Ukrainians who have both the motive and apparently the foresight to blow up this dam. Now, the Ruskies, on the other hand, by blowing up this dam, it makes it, like I said, much harder for them to cross into Kherson and try to advance. But if you want to take the position and say, well, they're actually doing this because they're afraid of Ukraine crossing the river towards them and, launching a counteroffensive. That's what the Ruskies are worried about. They think they're scared of the Ukrainian counteroffensive, so they had to blow this dam to protect themselves. It should be noted that that Russia pulled a lot of troops out of this area, and so you could argue, well, they only did that because they were planning on, flooding it and hurting Ukraine. But as a counterpoint to that, the electricity generated by the dam, because it was going through, what was it, Novakhovka. That town is controlled by Russia, and so I believe the electricity that was generated by that plant was going to the Russian side. They were reaping the benefits of this hydroelectric power station. Furthermore, the dammed up water was being diverted down to Crimea. With the dam gone, I don't think that Crimea is completely out of water, from what I understand, but this is going to have an impact there. So, all around, it seems that on net balance, the Russians, just as the Washington Post said, have more to lose from this dam being blown up than the Ukrainians, even if the Ukrainians have to suffer some. But on the PR side, if by having this dam blown up and Ukraine just automatically blaming Russia and assuming everyone will go along with that, it's good PR for them, because they can say, look at this terrible war crime. Now the West must intervene and stop Russia. The U.S. needs boots on the ground in Ukraine to stop Putin because he's such a terrible, no good, awful war criminal. And that's no good. America's got to stop him. He's literally Hitler. So, at the end of the day, sad to see this happen. I don't really care which side did it. I think that's quite bad. I do, as I've said from the beginning, I don't really have a dog in this fight. Though I have become increasingly annoyed with the Ukrainians and less sympathetic as the war drags on. And I simply just don't trust them at all. So could I see them doing this? Sure, I could see them doing it. Could I see Russia doing it? Perhaps if Russia had something to gain, sure. But from what I've seen, the Ruskies just didn't have much to gain from this. If anything, like I said, it's going to block, you can say, oh, I mean, the only thing I can really think of is that they're afraid of the Ukrainian counteroffensive, and so they're willing to destroy their own path to advancing in the war just to stop Ukraine at this juncture. I find that hard to believe. I don't think that they're afraid of a Ukrainian counteroffensive, but, if they were, they'd have to be really desperate to do this. So that's the only thing I've seen. If you guys know of any other points that might explain this, that might explain Russia doing it and not Ukraine, I'm all ears. So, with that said, I will see you folks back here tomorrow.